Welcome to the Becoming Superhuman podcast, where we interview extraordinary people to bring you the skills and strategies to overcome the impossible. And now, here's your host, Jonathan Levy.
Before we dive into today's episode, I want to let you guys know about an opportunity to learn some of the most important skills in life, if not the most important skills. And those are the skills of learning and doing so rapidly, effectively, and easily. You see, guys, I'm putting on a completely free 60-minute webinar that you guys can check out, where I will be going into my absolute best memory tips, learning tips, and speed reading tips so that you can immediately begin applying them and accelerating your learning of anything and everything. All you need to do to claim your spot in this free webinar is visit jle.vi/webinar. We have showings at many different times throughout the days for every time zone, but you have to log in and claim your spot. So that's jle.vi/webinar. And I really look forward to seeing what you guys achieve. This episode is brought to you by Organifi. You guys, one of the only things that every nutritional expert that we've had on the show seems to actually agree on is that we all need to eat more vegetables, eat more greens, eat organic, cut out all the processed junk. Well, who has the time, right? Who has the time to go out, do the shopping, make the salads, make the juices, make the smoothies? And that's what I love so much about Organifi. Their product is an all-organic green juice. It has all of the nutrients that you need. It tastes absolutely amazing, and it's made by wonderful people who I consider to be personal friends. And as listeners of this show, you guys can actually save 20% on your first order. And all you have to do is go to Organifi.com. That's ORGANIFI.com and use the coupon code SUPERHUMAN at checkout. Greetings, SuperFriends, and welcome to an extremely special episode of the Becoming Superhuman podcast, which is lovingly brought to you thanks to a review from Alice XXXO from Australia, who says, well worth many, many listens. To them all, you'd best start now. 5 stars, discovered Jonathan via Udemy course, and I am utterly obsessed. Aw. I've learned so much from this podcast and am plowing through episodes to absorb everything. I feel like before this, I wasn't even aware of what was possible for us usually not feeling so superhuman humans, but I've incorporated so much of what I've learned into my life. Aside from that, Jonathan is my favorite interviewer ever. Aww. He is knowledgeable, humble, and respectful, which makes it truly enjoyable to listen to. Alice, I got a little teary-eyed reading that one. That really made my day. That made my week and possibly my month. And for those of you who haven't left a review, please do, because wow, they're so great when we read them. To Alice's point and on to today's episode, this is an episode that is worth many, many, many listens. I'm going to listen to it way more than I normally listen to our own episodes, which is 2, 3, 4 times myself. Why, you ask? Well, do you guys remember how in 2016 we won Product Hunt's best podcast episode of the year? We got a Golden Kitty Award, which is kind of a really cool thing. And we did it because we had today's guest on the show. That's right. We have David Heinemeier Hansson back on the show. For those of you who haven't heard that episode, stop what you're doing, go back and listen to it. He is the epitome of what we call a super learner. He invented the Ruby on Rails software development platform, which is used by companies like Fiverr, Yellow Pages, Shopify, GitHub. Many of the websites that you use every day were built on technology that David himself invented. On top of that, he is the co-founder of Basecamp. He's been running it for almost 20 years. On top of that, he is an accomplished professional race car driver and amateur photographer, husband and father, and many, 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 many more things. This episode, we wanted to talk not about learning and productivity, but about a different subject that David and his partner have covered in their books, which is leadership, managing and working in remotely distributed companies, what the workplace of tomorrow will look like, and how we can all become superhuman in our productive lives and careers. Now, I have to say, I'm a huge fan of David's. And I tried as much as possible to let him present his ideas. With that said, so many of these ideas have shaped the way that I live my life, have shaped the way that I run my companies, and have influenced the lives of my employees and my customers. So again, I really can't overstress the fact, listen to this episode with a pen and paper, listen to it at least twice, and you guys will hear just so much about how to get great work done in less time with greater happiness from anywhere in the world that you choose to be. It's an incredible episode. I think it gives a really solid fight to the first episode we did with David, which was an award-winning podcast. It's a shame that Product Hunt has discontinued that award because I'm quite confident this episode would have won it again. Let me present to you guys my super friend, Mr. David Heinemeier Hansson. David, my friend, welcome back. It's such a pleasure to reconnect and have you back on the show.
My pleasure to be back here.
Yeah, and normally I end the show with thank yous, but in your case, I have to start the show with a thank you because our last episode together actually won us Product Hunt's Best Podcast Episode of the Year. So I wanted to thank you for that because it's been an incredible kind of check mark on the resume and also brought so many new people into the fold of the show.
That's awesome. Congratulations.
I think it's probably our best episode. So amazing. So to prime people in the audience, I mean, I recommend everyone go back and listen to that episode because we really talk about just how you've been able to learn so much, what you've learned, and how you've done so many amazing things from creating Ruby on Rails to founding Basecamp to rising up the ranks of the professional racing world. In today's conversation, we want to talk to people about building an online business, building a business, managing people and doing their best work with people that inspire them. Give people a little bit of context when you started thinking about these problems of management and global kind of locational independence. And did you always have this kind of focus?
I think it really got foisted upon me once I started working at companies that weren't that good, to be frank. And when I say weren't that good, I mean in managerial sense, that I was an employee at a bunch of technology companies in the early 2000s back in Copenhagen, Denmark. And I got such a wonderful education in how not to do things. Mm-hmm. And I think that that is actually, in many cases, more valuable than just being taught, oh, here's how you should do it. When you're being taught, oh, here's how you should not do it, you internalize things much more deeply. The scars and the frustration and the anxiety, that all sits a lot sharper in your psyche than simply a list of best practices someone just recites in front of you. So I got this wonderful education in bad management from working at a handful of companies just as I was getting started. And sort of augmented with that was the fact that I finished high school, and as is common in Denmark, I didn't go straight to college. I actually took 3 years off where I worked in the internet business. And I got this then firsthand exposure to all these forms of management and all these approaches and all these cliches really of management. And then after that, I went to business school and actually had a chance to contextualize some of the lessons that we were being given on organizational theory and motivation and so forth. And I think the combination of those two things, being exposed to the real world, having space carved out in your brain for a lot of answers that you wanted, like, hey, this doesn't feel right. This is not good. This is not motivating me. This is making me feel crappy. We're not making progress. We're not well functioning as a team or as a company. Why is that? And then being able to take those questions and partially answer them through the literature. I think there's a lot of great organizational theory that's been written for a long time that sort of, I think perhaps people go through school, if they haven't already been exposed to the quote unquote real world or the business or whatever, it doesn't really stick, right? Because a lot of these things are, if your frame of reference, if your background of experience can't sort of bounce off that, then it's hard to make it sticky. Well, for me, I had all these questions and I had all these frustrations that were penned up. And then I bounced all this literature, all this academia off it. And then I went out on the other side and thought, do you know what? if I ever get the chance to make the rules, if I ever get the chance to set the policies and be part of management, I am damn well going to be better than what was done to me.
I love it. It's a brilliant answer. There's so many comments that I want to add in. One is, I definitely get the impression that that's how you learn, because when I read your books, and I've read 2 out of the 3, I highlight them, and a lot of my notes say, God, I wish I'd learned this from a book instead of, the hard way. And there are so many instances where I'm like, oh man, David, where were you like 6 years ago? Where was this book 6 years ago? And also the idea that adults need to learn by connecting their experiences, something we talk about a lot in our courses, that you have to connect your experiences, contextualize the thing that you're learning. Otherwise, it's not relevant.
Which is actually why, as you say, you wish you had this book 6 years ago. In many cases, I don't think the book would have helped you. Right. Rework and Remote and the other books that we've written, they include a lot of thoughts about how we think things should be, but they really resonate and stick best with people who've been exposed to the dilemmas and the anxieties that we describe. If you had not already been in a situation where our advice would have made a difference, you won't remember it.
Yeah.
So the human brain, I think, is funny in that sense that you can't just load it up with facts and best practices and then sort of think that that's going to stick and that's going to work. You actually have to load it up first with frustration, experience, cuts, and all these other things. And then you create the space for the best practices and for the lessons to sort of stick to.
I couldn't agree more. Now, I want to ask you 2 questions at once, and I'm hoping we can merge the answer. One of the questions is, create a timeline for me, because I don't know when you wrote each one of the books. Was it before Basecamp, after Basecamp? What was happening in your life during the timeline of the last, I think I saw online that you've been running Basecamp for 17 years, but you were also before that doing really interesting stuff. And the second question is, contextualize each book for the audience, what it was you were learning at that point, and therefore what you are teaching in each book.
Sure, absolutely. So Basecamp was launched in 2004, but prior to that, there was a company called 37 Signals, which is essentially the company we are today, just renamed Basecamp, that was founded in 1999 by Jason Fried, my business partner. I connected with Jason and started working with him in 2001. And we worked together for a couple of years on client projects. 37 Signals was a web design shop and was doing design work for clients. I would do the technical part on a couple of projects. And then in 2003, we started working on Basecamp together. And as I said, we launched that in 2004. And I think about a year after that launch, we had just gotten so many questions and comments and interested people in our process, not just the product, but how did you guys just make Basecamp? How did you guys decide what to price it? How did you guys decide what you were going to do for marketing? What, you don't have any salespeople? How does that work? So there were all these questions out there. And Jason and I thought, that's interesting. I mean, we could actually just teach this. This is not rocket science. Mm-hmm. So that's what we tried to do. About a year after the launch of Basecamp, we created a series of workshops called the Building of Basecamp. And it was these small workshops, about, I think, 30 people would show up, and we would go all day, 8 hours of material with a 40-minute lunch break or something like that. And we would just bombard people with basically everything that we had learned creating Basecamp and running the company up until that point, which was a fair amount of stuff. So after we'd been doing that for a couple of years, we kind of summarized all those lessons from the Building a Basecamp workshops into our first real book in this domain called Getting Real. Mm-hmm. The subtitle is The Smarter, Faster, Easier Way to Build a Successful Web Application. And as you can tell just from that, it was quite specific. It was quite specific to, hey, here are the very concrete lessons that we've taken away from building a web app, Basecamp, and putting it out there and getting it successful and so forth. And that did really well. We self-published it. People could buy a PDF and just download it. And it did really well. And we got a lot of feedback then from people and all sorts of camps that we didn't expect. We thought we were just writing to other software developers, but we started hearing from people in all sorts of different kinds of businesses. Hey, do you know what? You might be talking about software here, but these things apply just as well to my architecture firm. They apply just as well to my PR firm. They apply just as well to these other domains that you perhaps hadn't intended your lessons for, but they're just as relevant for it. So that was kind of an eye-opening response, that the lessons that we thought were perhaps quite specific to the software industry were broader lessons that applied much more commonly to businesses of all different kinds. So we kind of mulled on that for a couple of years, and we kept writing at the same time our weblog, Signal versus Noise, which has been in existence since 1999, and we've been publishing probably hundreds of essays there every year. And we were building up this catalog of our recorded experiences and our recorded patterns and lessons and so forth. And in 2010, we took all of that. We took the specific ideas from Getting Real, made them slightly broader, combined them with the 10 years of publishing on Signal versus Noise, and turned it into the book Rework, which was our first book that we published with a major publisher out in bookstores, actually wrapped in hardbound leather and all this stuff. And Rework really then validated that notion that the lessons we had taken away from building Basecamp and running Basecamp were not at all specific. And these were challenges that most entrepreneurs would face in some form or another, and lots of employees would face even working in larger companies. And book turned into a New York Times bestseller. I think we've sold more than 500,000 copies so far, including all sorts of wonderful translations. I think we've sold 90,000 copies in China, 30,000 copies in Russia. And I think there was just a sense that this was a different kind of business book. It wasn't written by academics, it wasn't written by journalists, and it wasn't written by researchers. It was written by practitioners like Jason and I, who've not sat down to theorize like what is the future of work. No. It was basically, let's sit down and sift through 15 years of running our own company and pluck out the best ideas that we had taken from that and compile it into something that can provoke people and make them think. Because the other thing I find with a lot of business books is that either they tend to be overly prescriptive in a actionable advice kind of sense, and we have some of that, but I don't actually find that that's that valuable. What's really valuable is opening up space in people's minds to pose new questions. We take so much for granted. We take so many ideas and practices for granted in business. And of course, this is how we're supposed to do things. And sometimes all you need to see the world in a different light is to look at someone else who had viewed the world in a different light and go like, oh, that worked? That's surprising. Like I didn't know that was a thing that could actually work. And then once you kind of crack open the skull in a sense, in that way, you open people up to exploring a much wider variety of techniques and motivations and vision, really, for what companies can be and how you can run them. And that's really just gratifying, right? It's the kind of slow process that Jason and I have gone through over the past 15 years of building a business. If we can help speed that up, at least just by a little bit, then I think that'd be great. And then finally, we wrote Remote, Office Not Required in, I think, 2014, which was really a book that was born out of astonishment because Jason and I had been working remotely with Basecamp since the inception. I met Jason essentially online in 2001 when I sent him an email giving him a bunch of answers to a question he had posted on Signal versus Noise about how to do something in PHP programming, and we started working together. We worked together for 6 months before we even spoke on the phone. Wow. This was just all instant message and email and so forth. And then we spoke on the phone once or twice, and I think it took at least a year, maybe even longer, before we met in person. And then we continued to work remotely, me in Copenhagen, Denmark, 7 time zones away from Chicago. And then even when I moved to Chicago in 2005, we quickly realized that me coming to an office every day and sitting right next to Jason was actually not that productive. We thought that, oh, this is going to be so much better. We perhaps were held back by the fact that I was in Copenhagen, Denmark, and now we'd be in the same time zone, and that'd just be wonderful. And we ended up getting less done. And that was really an interesting aha moment, too. The fact that even with our principles and our approaches, that we would still get less done when we just crammed into the same office and tried to work shoulder to shoulder for 8 hours a day. Wow. So we'd kind of just founded the company on remote. We've then doubled down on the company on remote after seeing sort of the productivity benefits of it. And then we'd built a whole company of, by the time we wrote remote, maybe, 40 people at the company. And I just took it for granted that everyone had realized the benefits of remote work.
Right.
And then I had a series of conversations in a very short period of time. Maybe within 3 months, I met with 3 different entrepreneurs who I otherwise thought were smart, capable people. And we had conversations about remote work. And those conversations really just astounded me because they were exceptionally shallow. They were exceptionally glib, and they were exceptionally conventional in all sorts of ways where I thought like, hey, wait a minute. These entrepreneurs are really smart people doing very fascinating, interesting work in technology. And yet they haven't even bothered to scratch the mere surface of the arguments for why remote work might be an effective way of working. What is going on here? How is this knowledge not better distributed? I thought sort of had just assumed that everyone had taken the same lessons away from a decade's worth of improvements in information technology, and seeing just the number of companies who had been launched off a remote work setup do well, that everyone would have just like, oh yeah, of course, remote work is a good idea and you should totally do it. And then I had these three conversations just right in a row where I just went like, Jesus, someone has to just summarize these basic arguments for why remote is a good idea and encapsulate just some of the basic principles for how you can do it. And I thought, well, why shouldn't that be us? So we sat down, wrote the book, and pushed it out there. And it's sort of part argument for why remote work is a good thing. And then it's part handbook in then how do you do it once you're convinced.
Bingo. And I want to touch so much more on that, but I have questions along the way. The first one is, your humility amazes me because you didn't even mention that somewhere along this journey, you created Ruby on Rails. When did that happen in this whole, before getting real?
Sure. It was before getting real, because actually when I started building Basecamp in 2003, one of the magic moments for me was the fact that I had complete freedom over the technology. When Jason and I had worked with clients in the years preceding and even before that, usually there was some sort of imposed idea of what technology we should use. They were like, oh, we like PHP, or we like this, that, and the other thing. Now, here comes along a project where we're making it essentially for ourselves. And I can pick whatever I want. Well, awesome. I learned about Ruby from Martin Fowler and Dave Thomas and some of these other characters that were early in the Western adoption of Ruby, and they were really adopting it for explanatory purposes. I remember reading articles in IEEE magazine by, I think, Martin Fowler and Dave Thomas talking about like, hey, I want to explain to you a general concept in technology and programming. Just for the sake of argument, let me show you in Ruby. Not because you're using Ruby, because at that time, chances would be that you were not, but because Ruby is such a wonderfully easy language for anyone to understand. It basically reads like what we call pseudocode, like if you just wrote code out a little bit like English. So it's a really good language for explaining core concepts, regardless of whether you're working in that language or not. Well, I thought if these great technologists who I deeply respect and admire pick Ruby when they have a freedom of choice to pick whatever they want, then why wouldn't I pick Ruby when I actually have a choice to build something with it? So I picked Ruby. I started working with it and very quickly had the epiphany that Ruby was the glove for my mind. That this was the programming language I had been waiting for this whole time. Up until discovering Ruby, I was a pretty reluctant programmer. I really didn't think of myself as a programmer. I didn't think of programming as something that was core to necessarily what I wanted to do long term. After finding Ruby, that all changed. And I fell in love with the language, and I started using the language to build what I wanted to build, and that was Basecamp. So we started building Basecamp in 2003. Ruby at the time was in very, very early stages in Western adoption. Most of the stuff was coming out of the Japanese community and was in Japanese or whatever, but I could still read the code, right? Like Ruby's written in English. So even if a lot of the documentation at the time was in Japanese, the code was in English, and I read all of it, right? I read the whole standard library. I read a bunch of Ruby code, and I thought like, this is just such a wonderful language. It was such an accelerant in my learning curve for programming. I'd been doing programming sort of on off for several years in advance, but there was just so many concepts that finally clicked for me once I adopted Ruby. And I then started building all this tooling that we needed to create Basecamp, because as I said, like there weren't frameworks, or at least not a lot, and they certainly weren't comprehensive in Ruby at the time. So I had to do a lot of the groundwork myself. Oh, how do you talk to a database? How do you render a template? How do you do this, that, and the other thing? And before I knew it, I had this whole toolkit of frameworks and libraries that I had built up because I needed them to build Basecamp. I thought like, oh, this is cool. I've used all this other open source technology up until this point. We used the Apache web server. We used the MySQL database. We used all these other aspects of the open source culture, Linux to run our servers on. I owe this community to share the bits that I've found and I've developed when I can. So we wrapped this stuff up, or I wrapped this stuff up, and it became Ruby on Rails, which was released in late 2004 then. And here we are working on it ever since, 14 years later. I'm still enamored by Ruby. I still love writing Ruby. I still get withdrawal symptoms when I go for too long without writing Ruby. And I still love working with Rails and the community around it.
It's absolutely incredible. And I want to give context to some people. Ruby on Rails is like the development platform for most of the developers that I talk to. I discovered it because a developer I was working with was like, you need to read this book, Getting Real. And he told me, Ruby on Rails is so beautiful. Even you can learn it, Jonathan. And it's used every day by billions of people. Fiverr, Airbnb, GitHub, Shopify, Yellow Pages, early version of Twitter, Groupon, Hulu, Kickstarter. Is it weird for you that billions of people use something that you built every single day?
It's great. It's wonderful. But I also have a fair amount of distance to that, because it's not like these things wouldn't exist if it wasn't for Ruby on Rails, right? Like they would just pick something else. It's kind of like, hey, isn't it amazing that everyone eats with a fork? Like whoever invented the fork, I mean, can't really take credit for feeding the entire world. But you can sort of celebrate the fact and be proud of the fact that you played a small part, and not so much whether something would have been possible or not possible. Although I do think I have heard from people who sort of felt that their career was possible in a way because they too discovered Ruby or Rails. And I felt the same way, that prior to discovering Ruby, as I said, I was a reluctant programmer. I could very well have fallen out of programming altogether and ended up doing something entirely different. And I've heard from tons of developers who felt the same way, that they were disillusioned with their tools and that they weren't actually enjoying their work that much. But then finding a tool set that really resonated with them, that really they could connect with, was pivotal in sort of turning things around and making them love to be programmers. So I think that that's really more of it, that there's a bunch of programmers out there who get to work for these companies you just mentioned and the hundreds of thousands of others who've used Ruby on Rails over the years, who were just happier programmers. They were happier programmers because we got them out of whatever environment that they were in before and got them to discover Ruby. And sort of this discovery of Ruby just led to, I think, a measurable increase in programmer happiness and productivity. And I think that that's perhaps the thing I'm most proud about.
I love that. And I also want to add, in this world of Getting Real and the lean startup where speed is money, and, if you don't have a product that actually works before you run out of money, and you and I both share on Twitter, I was recently reading, we share similar views on the whole overhype of raising money and how you really don't need to raise money to build a solid business. But I think speed of deployment of building that minimum viable product is life or death. And I think the speed with which you can deploy something on Rails means that many companies exist today that would have fizzled out and died had it not been available as a tool.
I mean, that's really why I developed Ruby on Rails in the first place. That when we were building Basecamp, I didn't see a great path forward with the tools that I had available that could allow me to do what it is that we did, which was to build this web app, which is me as the technical person on the entire team doing everything, all the programming, all the servers, all the everything, on 10 hours per week. That was the amount of time I had left over once I finished school and once I'd done some other commercial projects. That was just that, right?
Incredible.
Ruby on Rails was really born from these extreme constraints on resources. And I think that's why it's such a great fit for entrepreneurs who want to build something by themselves and don't have to take other people's money, that they really truly can build software for the web with a tiny team and compete with the biggest software makers out there, because the tools are just productive enough that you can put something together just with your own hands, that you don't need to hire a whole team. You can basically have a founding team for a company who knows how to build things, and they can build this thing themselves. And that's really satisfying, that I'm helping arm the resistance. I'm helping arm the rebellion against sort of heavily funded VC-backed companies. I'm much rather and much more interested in helping all the people who are not in Silicon Valley than the people who are in Silicon Valley. Even though, as you said, plenty of the companies on the hit list of who've used Ruby on Rails to build things. They are from Silicon Valley. That's wonderful. That's great. Everyone deserves to be happy and have a good development environment. But if I have to pick my allegiance with who I'm most interested in helping, it's all the people who are not in Silicon Valley. It's all the people who don't have access to seed funding and venture capital, and giving them a tool set that they can use to fight back and punch up is invigorating.
I love that. And I love that that's bringing us back from our wonderful tangent to remote work and building these businesses. I have to tell you, at one point I had t-shirts designed which said, I don't build quote unquote startups, I build businesses. And it was exactly that, because a startup is a bunch of people trying to figure out a way to actually build a legitimate business. Whereas what I love about what you've done is you built a business from day one. Was Jason of the similar mindset when you guys met, or did you guys coalesce and create this shared culture? Because so much of what you teach in remote is you have to create this culture of trust, of innovation, of non-conventional thinking, more than a company where you see people face to face every single day. I'm just interested how two people who are such unique thinkers found each other and somehow had a matching of the minds.
It's rare. I think it is rare. It's not just that Jason and I have a matching of the minds. It's that it's two different minds that have two different areas of main expertise that we can blend and use together for maximum punch. Jason is a wonderful designer and writer. I do my part on programming and on writing. And together we really sort of cover most of the ground that you need to cover to create a business, just between the two of us. Not that we could have built this whole thing by ourselves, absolutely not. We have 50-odd wonderful people at the company, but we at least had exposure to all the main areas of the business and had our hands in doing them, right? Like when we started Basecamp, there were 4 people total working on it. It was Jason and me. There was Ryan, an additional designer. It was Matt on writing and some design. And we had to do everything, right? So I think that just that overlap, that we had complementary skills that allowed us to build things with our own hands was really important. And then, as you say, the second thing is that we had just enough shared experience, having gone through the dot-com boom and bust together. Jason had worked at a bunch of American startups and ludicrously overfunded companies that blew up spectacularly when the dot-com bust went through. And I had seen the same thing, partly from the sidelines and observing the American industry, and partly from the inside in the miniature Danish version of it. So we were kind of forged from the same fire, and we took away many of the same lessons. And I think both Jason and I kind of perhaps in some ways had a similar upbringing of we had to work for our money, right? Both Jason and I worked all sorts of commercial jobs growing up and got an appreciation for the sort of basics of business, that you have to sell something for more than it costs you to make it. And if you have money left over, that's profit. And if you have profit, you get to stay in business. So many of these core lessons that seem obvious, that seem self-evident, were kind of lost or washed away in the avalanche of money and bullshit that came out of Silicon Valley, first in the dot-com boom and bust, and then sort of a trickle ever since, and then it kind of sort of spewed ever higher in periods since. So we kind of both had this sort of sense of resistance. And part of that, too, I think, was because neither Jason and I were in these tech hubs, right? Jason is from Chicago, and 37 Signals was founded in Chicago. And it was just far enough away from the echo chamber of Silicon Valley or other tech hubs, and certainly Denmark is as well, that we weren't infected or even infatuated by these tales of spectacular exponential growth and wealth, that we were just confident and comfortable in our own skin and building our own thing at our own pace in a sustainable way that made us happy, that we got to work with our hands and we got to do our own thing, and no one should tell us we had to do it faster, we had to do it a different way, or we had to sell our company, or we had to take on investors, or we had to do any of those things. That we got to really chart our own path. And I think over time, now I've worked with Jason for damn near 20 years now, that we've really just come to appreciate that sense that there's overlap. If you think of the Venn diagram, there's a big shared area, but there's also just enough on either side that we don't have exactly the same ideas about everything. And it's that tension, the shared trust that comes from the overlap and the shared sort of general vision, and then the tension that comes from the parts that don't overlap, that provoke and spark ever better solutions and ever better thinking, sharper, clearer thoughts on both business and organizational theory and on software and all these other parts of it. And then sort of there's the comfort of having worked with someone for a very long time, that you know that you can have very spirited discussions and arguments and disagreements, and yet still believe that deep down we want the same thing. We want to create wonderful, great software that stands the test of time and sticks around until the end of the internet, as we like to say, and build a wonderfully stable, sustainable business where we take really good care of the employees that we have, but we never overextend ourselves, we never overhire, we never sort of take off more than we can chew, and then we stick to the things that we like and our favorite passions. Jason with design and writing, me on programming and writing, and we're sort of just like, this is it. This is good enough. We can do this for the rest of time.
I love it.
Or for the rest of our time, at least.
It's such a underappreciated and forgotten point of entrepreneurship in the startup culture, that the point of entrepreneurship is to make lives better, both inside and outside of the company. It is not to get to some end destination, whether that be an exit or an IPO. Entrepreneur in the classical definition is someone who takes resources from an area of low economic value and creates economic value. And that's exactly what you've done. I want to ask you, how many hours a week are you actually at Basecamp?
I work about 40 hours a week. I've worked about 40 hours a week for the past 15 years or so. We're pretty big on keeping it to that and no more. And also not materially less, right? So even today, as I said, Basecamp has been in business for 14 years. Jason and I, we don't have to work. We certainly don't have to work from an economic point of view. We've done well enough with Basecamp that we could just sit back and enjoy the mojitos on the beach, but there's no deeper sense of meaning or purpose in that. And both Jason and I derive a great sense of meaning and purpose from continuing to work on Basecamp, the company, and on Basecamp, the product. So that's what we do. But at the same time, we never developed those toxic workaholic habits that unfortunately inflict a lot of startup founders when they kick things up and they think they have to work 80, 100, 120 hours a week to make it happen. And we never did. We never had that pressure, either factual or imagined, that we had to work like slaves, that we thought meaning comes from doing great work, and then it comes from a bunch of other things too. It comes from spending copious amounts of time with the people that you love. It comes from pursuing other passions in life. I have a bunch of hobbies that I'm passionate about, and I don't want any of them to take over my entire life. I think that's unfortunately common heroic myth, that if you want to be a successful entrepreneur, that's the only thing you can think about 24/7. It's the only thing you can do 24/7, right? That there's no room for anything else. And it's just such a lie. It's such a misconception that entrepreneurs keep telling themselves to feel good about their addiction. And that addiction to work and to accomplishment or whatever, I don't think it's actually that healthy. And I don't think it's that sustainable. And I think if you look at successful entrepreneurs who've gone the distance, most of them are not working 120 hours still. And plenty of the people who tried burn out spectacularly and tragically so, that they end up with not only nothing in terms of business, but also a completely screwed up sense of balance and habits and purpose in life. And neither Jason and I were ever on that, because we saw what we could do and what we could build with far, far less than what is supposedly mandated of the heroic entrepreneur who risks everything and puts in everything. That we saw, like, wait a minute, there's plenty of people and competitors and people in adjacent spaces to us who do that are doing no better work than we are. We're doing wonderful work that we're incredibly proud of, that customers are liking enough that they want to pay for, and we're working 40 hours a week. Hey, even in the summer, we're working 32 hours a week because we take a day off. We take Fridays off in the summer. And it still works. Oh, wait a minute. Maybe this is one of those things that people just take for granted, that entrepreneurs are the kind of people who have to invest everything all the time to make it. And it's just not true. I think it's one of these hard lessons to, I think, internalize, is that most of the things that most people do most of the time don't matter. They're not the ones that move the needle.
Right.
And especially for entrepreneurs who work 120 hours a week, the vast, vast majority of those hours are waste or even net negative contributions to the business, that in many cases the business would be better off if you spent less time on it. It's certainly true when you spend that time on management. One of the ideas that we have at Basecamp is that we have no full-time managers. Both Jason and I, we're managers, but we're also makers. And we try to spend the majority of our time making and the minority of our time managing. Because managers who have 40 hours or, God forbid, 80 hours on their hands tend to come up with a whole lot of management. And you know what? That is usually mostly bullshit. And it's mostly negative, mostly a drag on the productivity of the teams that they're so unfortunate enough to have a manager that spends 80 hours a week trying to manage them. Most creative people do not need someone to chaperone them for 80 hours a week. And I think they're better off and they do better work when someone don't, right? Like maybe there's 10 hours of management a week. Maybe there's 15 hours of management a week. Maybe some weeks there's only 5 hours of management a week. If you have someone hired to be a manager for 40 or 80 hours, that's what they're going to put in week after week, right? Jason and I can choose to say, like, in this week, I'm going to put in 5 hours of management. Next week, I might put in 25. Hey, on the rare week, I might even put in 40. But we're never going to put in 80, and we're never going to put in 40 week after week after week. So we just end up with a quite different company in that sense. And we end up with a quite different life balance, not only for ourselves, but for our employees as well. I think one of the myths about workaholism is that you can somehow contain it just to the executive team or to the entrepreneurs. No, that shit leaks down, right? It's trickle-down workaholism, which is the title of an essay I posted on Signal versus Noise a while back, is that if the founder is working 80, 100, or 120 hours a week, like they're going to want to have a jam sesh on like Saturday night, right? And they're going to expect that they get an answer to their email at 11 in the evening. And it's a myth to think that you can somehow separate that, wall that off, such that these entrepreneurs who work these fantastical hours can also somehow gel well with the team that only works 40 hours a week. It doesn't work like that. Everyone else picks up from the top. And they pick up that, oh, if I want to do well here, I damn well better model the actions and work approach that the people at the top do. And thus it trickles down and everyone starts working these crazy hours, even if it doesn't actually contribute anything to neither the bottom line or the health and happiness of the company. So Jason and I are also quite cognizant of the fact that we are role models within the company and our behavior will be modeled. So if we want a healthy staff, we have to put a healthy example forward. We have to take vacation. We have to have hobbies. We have to turn off the computer on the weekend. We have to do all these other things that we want our staff and our employees such that they can see that not only is this good, it's allowed. So
I love that so much. And I guess, asking the question, I made the assumption on the other way around, which is you have this racing career, you have many hobbies. I had assumed that you had been able to shift back and, do 20 hours of work a week. And I think it's so interesting that you say, no, that you're working exactly the prescribed kind of amount. It kind of contextualizes for me because I read your book and in many ways your book is, I think, a more practical implementation manual of one of my favorite books of all time, which is The 4-Hour Workweek, which introduces these ideas of hiring people abroad and having an assistant in a country you've never been to, but offers the practical nuts and bolts. And I'll give a quick story, which is I read 4-Hour Workweek in my last business where I was a workaholic and I outsourced a bunch of labor with none of the skills, strategies, tips, and tricks that I now use every day, many of which, by the way, came from remote. And it was a huge, huge failure. And I ended up having to work more to try and clean up the work that other people were doing. And I shied away for many, many years from hiring remote workers or having employees at all. I was so burned. And along about 2016, this current company with the online courses and podcasts was growing so fast that I had kind of no choice. I was living in a country where the English wasn't good enough to work with kind of local people, with all due respect to the local population, that I had to. And I came back to the trough and said, well, DHH wrote Getting Real. DHH and Jason Fried wrote Getting Real, and that was incredible. So let's read this remote. And I built a company in many ways around this and around a lot of the ideas in 4-Hour Workweek. And today we're 13 people, full and part-time, in, I think, 7 countries. I've met one person on my team in person, which I think is incredible.
It's fascinating, right? And it's such a good example of how the world has just changed. Like what you just described was absolutely not possible, or at least not feasible in any meaningful way for
Right.
a large number of people 20 years ago, right? And I'd say Tim Ferriss's book, 4 Hour Work Week, was major inspiration for me as well. And a lot of it was really a sense of permission. He had 2 wonderful concepts in that book. And one of them is lifestyle design, that there's a lot of people who don't realize it, but they have a tremendous amount of power to design a different lifestyle. They didn't have to accept that things are the way that they are. And I thought about that when we were building Basecamp. I've lived in a bunch of different countries. For the last 7 years, I've spent about half my time in Spain, in a pretty small touristy town on the South Coast that had zero tech scene, had zero connection to sort of any sense of technology down there, but still I was plugged in just as well to the rest of the world as I would have been if I had sat in Silicon Valley or in New York or whatever. And that's a new phenomenon too, right? Like I got to live in a place that 20 years ago was just for retirees or tourists or the people who service them. And that was just a wonderful concept that I took in part away from this notion of a lifestyle design, that you can design your life in different ways. And the other thing I also took away from that book was the idea of deferred living, that there's so many people who walk around and spend their 20s, 30s, 40s, maybe even 50s building, harvesting, accumulating, such that by the time they hit 60 or whatever, they can retire and then they can live the good life. You know what? Talk to any 60-year-old or 70-year-old and ask whether the quote-unquote good life is as good as it is physically and mentally and whatever as it was in their 20s or their 30s. And they'll say, no, it wasn't. And most of them probably would trade a fair amount of their fortune, if not the bulk of it, to have the stamina and
the knees of a 20-year-old.
Exactly, of a 20-year-old or a 30-year-old, right? So this idea that you should slave away, or the modern expression is you should compress your work life. You should work these crazy hours with the sole focus and dedication on business for all of your 20s and mostly your 30s too. And then after that, then you get to live the good life. I found it was just such a pig-headed approach. And part of the permission that I got to think about things in that way was Tim Ferriss and this idea of the deferred living, and that I was not going to defer my living. That even as Basecamp was growing and I had all these things going on, I was not going to defer my living. I was still going to go out with friends. I was still going to have hobbies. I was still going to pursue all these other things. And I was just going to put in about 40 hours a week. And that would be plenty. And I would be well rewarded just doing that. And whatever reward that I may or may not have been able to get if I had pushed in more would not have been worth giving up the rest of my life for.
Phenomenal. I want to give people a little bit more explanation. I typically have a policy of not reading the book before I do the interview, because otherwise I take so much for granted. And I think that's definitely true of our interview thus far, because as you said, like to me, it's now so basic, this idea of hiring people from all over the world, and that actually we have a better team and we're happier because we don't, have this one-upsmanship of who's in the office last. Sell the audience though on, as you said, remote is in many ways an argument for remote working. And I'm really biting my tongue not to quote the book because I have you right here. So tell people the benefits of remote working and why it's beneficial, why it works better, and why you see it as the future of work.
Sure. So remote work, first of all, allowed us to build Basecamp. So I would not have been able to build Basecamp if upon, let's say I'd met Jason in a different environment, let's say at a conference, it required me to move to Chicago right away. That just wouldn't have happened, right? So we were able to build Basecamp because I got to stay in Copenhagen, Denmark for the first couple of years of Basecamp's existence and work with him, right? So I'm just eternally grateful for that, just on my own personal trajectory. But second of all, what it has allowed us to do with Basecamp is it's allowed us to hire the very best people in the world who just happen to live where they wanted to live. We actually right now don't have anyone in Silicon Valley. We don't even have anyone in New York, which is 2 of the major tech hubs in the US. And we have people spread out all over wonderful places in the US and in Canada and Europe, people we would never have had a chance to hire if upon making our job posting, we would have said, oh yeah, and you have to relocate to Chicago. we would have had to fish in the tiny pond that is Chicago or the people willing to move there. And it's not that there aren't great people in Chicago. There's lots of wonderful people in Chicago, but there's so many fewer people who can do the work that we need done at the level that we need it done that there are in the rest of the world. And that's just pure mathematics, or that's just pure statistics, I should say, right? Or demographics. What, we have 3 million people who live within a commuter's distance of our office. It's just such a tiny talent pool. Why would you limit yourself to that? Even if you happen to be in one of those major tech hubs, let's say San Francisco or whatever. First of all, you're fishing in the same dirty pool that everyone else has been fishing in for decades, right? So you're constantly sort of competing against each other. And there's benefits to that, certainly for employees, but there's also a fair amount of downsides to that the average tenure, I think, in the tech industry right now is about 18 months. That just sounds atrocious to me, right? Like if you're constantly changing colleagues and peers, it's very hard to develop those permanent, stable bonds that sort of help you do the best work of your life. So at Basecamp, we've been able to retain people in part because we've allowed them to live where they want to live. We've allowed them not to quit their job just because their spouse needed to move to a different city or whatever it is, they wanted to live closer to family, or they just wanted to live in a different place in the world, right? Like they can get to stay at Basecamp for all this time. We had a bunch of people, including myself, who've lived all over the world and continue to do wonderful work for Basecamp for, in several cases, more than a decade. Second of all, I think the quality of life that comes from not having to do a commute is intense. I live in Malibu now, and every now and then I have to go into Los Angeles during rush hour, and I just think to myself, how do people live like this? How do you spend a sizable portion of your life sitting in bumper-to-bumper traffic and inching along, right? It just seems miserable. And not only does it seem miserable, all the research backs up that it is miserable.
Yes.
And I know that some people say, well, I'm really good at listening to podcasts, and maybe they're listening to podcasts like this, and that's a good way to pass the time. But it still is a pretty constricted way to pass your time. And especially if you have a family, sort of those hours, an hour before work and an hour after work that you have to add on to do this atrocious commute just takes time away from other things you might rather be doing. And if you think to yourself, let's say I have an hour or two of commute every single day, all year round, how much time is that you could have spent on something else? It's massive, vast amounts of time that you could have spent either pursuing your own projects or spending them with people that you love or otherwise investing them in things that give something back more than sitting in bumper-to-bumper traffic. And then finally, I'd say remote work in many cases gives people who want that an opportunity to have a personal office where the door closes, which is a luxury that used to be commonplace in technology industry, but has gone away and unfortunately been killed by the quote unquote modern and hip idea of open office spaces, open plan offices, and long tables where everyone sits shoulder to shoulder. And for me, that's just absolute misery. If I had had to work in such an environment, I have no doubt in my mind that I could not have even begun to create any of the things that I have created. Because for me, my sense of peace and space and mind works in such a way that I need long stretches of uninterrupted time to be able to accomplish anything. And try getting 4 or 5 hours of continuous time sitting at an open plan office like that. It's pretty rare, right? Like there's all sorts of interruptions, both visually, audibly, and people just come over and tap you on the shoulder that kind of constantly break you out of the flow.
Yes.
And it just seems like that's a horrible way for most people to work. So those are just some of the benefits. As you said, we wrote all of Remote that has even more of them, and they back them up with links to scientific studies and stats on some of these for example, medical and health reasons for why sitting in traffic all day long is so terrible for you. But it just seemed like the compound reasons for doing this were so far outweighed the negatives that it seemed like a no-brainer. That's not to say that there are negative aspects of it. You shouldn't be naive about that. Just the fact of being able to see people face to face has real enduring value. And I think humans are born in some ways to create deeper and more lasting bonds when that happens. Not that it has to happen, and it doesn't happen for everyone just because you see people. I've certainly met plenty of people face to face and even worked with them that I did not create any lasting bonds with. But I think if you are working with someone over the long term, it does help. So at Basecamp, for example, we do meet up twice a year. We bring the whole company together, and we spend a week together in Chicago, where the primary purpose is to nourish and strengthen those bonds.
Mm-hmm. Is that work time, or is that team building time and kind of social time?
It's kind of all of the above. We work on things together. I find that one of the great ways of reestablishing and strengthening these bonds is just to sit down with someone you've worked with online and work them together next to each other. The key part of that, for me at least, is that it's an injection, right? Like I get this one injection twice a year of 1 week of working with people, and then I get to spend the other, 50 weeks apart. And that's a great ratio for me.
Right. We actually just announced to our employees that we're going to do our first ever real life in the real world retreat in the Philippines. And we're all really excited about it. So I'm looking for ideas of what kind of problems can we throw on the table for people to play with. I want to comment on two things. One, you left out what I think is probably one of the most important things that I still struggle with as a manager of a remote business is, I won't say trust, but dependence, right? Because it's so easy when you look people in the eye face to face to have this misguided sense that, they're doing what they need to do and they're not wasting time. And I think one of the most challenging things as a remote business manager is just taking a deep breath and going, okay, it's all right that not everyone is logged online right now. They're probably working, or it's all right that not everyone has updated Basecamp. Maybe they'll check in at the end of the day and check off all the tasks that are, mission critical or whatever it might be. I also think it's really interesting, the one that you left out, which is if people don't live in San Francisco, they don't need to be paid $200,000 a year to have a great quality of life. Are cost savings a factor, or do you guys pay Silicon Valley salaries outside of Silicon Valley?
It's funny you bring that up, because we actually just a couple of months ago decided that we are going to start paying Silicon Valley salaries to everyone outside of Silicon Valley. We don't have a single person in Silicon Valley. We've just moved all our salary targets to be in the top 10% of what companies in Silicon Valley pay their people. And We're not doing that because we have to, right? We have had no people, actually, I shouldn't say that. We'd had a couple of people who've left to go work in Silicon Valley over the past 15 years, so less than a handful. This was not a major source of attrition. We didn't have an attrition problem. We didn't have a competitive issue where we couldn't retain our employees, and then we had to do this. We chose to do this because Basecamp, after 14 years in business, is doing really, really well. And we share the wealth to some extent.
Yeah.
But we try to take very good care of everyone that we have at the company. And one of the ways we can do that is by paying someone who lives in, let's say, Tennessee or Orlando or even Chicago or Atlanta or Arizona or any of these other places that generally do not have pay scales that correspond to what Silicon Valley people are paid, and then bring them up to that. And then let them reap the benefits of that. So for us, we decided very early on that, we decided once we sort of instituted a clear regimented way of doing pay, which is a process that's a couple of years old, where we started getting more both sophisticated and dedicated to treating pay with the same sort of rigor that we would treat any other aspect of the financials of the business. And as doing that, we normalized all pay scales such that everyone who's working at Basecamp in the same position at the same level of seniority would be paid the same. We basically eliminated all forms of negotiation as a salary thing. We eliminated all forms of having to ask for a raise. Raises do simply come automatically. We track the market, the top of the market, and now the top of the market in the most expensive market in the world for software developers every year. And we automatically give people raises and we automatically raise them up. But even prior to that, we were paying everyone the same. And it didn't matter where they were being placed. When we initially put this in place, we said, we're going to pay everyone near the top of the market of what people are being paid in Chicago. Hey, Chicago is where we started. That seemed like a good place to pick. Chicago is already one of the top paying markets in technology in the US. It's not the top. There's a couple of Silicon Valley, New York or above, but it's pretty high up there, right? So for the vast majority of people that we have, this was even more top of their local markets. And we chose to do it for everyone. So we do it for people who work in the US, we do it for people who work in Canada, we do it for people who work in Europe. And in some cases, particularly in Europe, we have, for example, one software developer that works out of Spain. And in Spain, I've lived in Spain for, as I said, many years. Salaries are so much lower. So for Spain, for example, our rates are not just the top of the market. Like, I'd be very surprised if they're not like within the 0.01% top of the market. But we thought that was just an equitable, fair way of doing it. Not because we had to, again, we could have hired these people at a much lower pay, but because that's what we felt good about. And that's what we could afford. But at the same time, I fully recognize that there are other businesses that start under other circumstances where having the competitive advantage of being able to hire people at great local pay for them while still being far less paid than, say, Silicon Valley is what helps them get off the ground.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
As I repeatedly said when we did our announcement of what we're targeting to pay, was that we didn't start out like this. Like, if you look at the salaries when I started working with Jason and in the early days of Basecamp, they were vastly different. In fact, I remember my exact salary. When I started working with Jason in 2001, he was paying me $15 an hour, right? So that was certainly a different scale, right? And even after I became a partner at Basecamp and we started taking our salaries as sort of profit distributions for quite a long time, those profit distributions were far, far below what quote unquote market was for a software developer at the time, right? So this is something that just takes time, but I am a firm believer that once you do reach the point where your business can afford to pay high salaries, you almost have an obligation to do so. And maybe part of this is also we look at compensation a little differently at Basecamp, is that we're not a startup rocket ship where people either explode or make it to the moon. Mm-hmm. We are a solid business that's been solidly profitable for many years and is not a high-risk proposition, which means that you're not going to strike it rich on some options when we get IPO or bought out, because we have no plans of neither IPOing or getting bought out. So the main way we return part of the wealth of the company to employees is simply through higher base salaries. And one thing we've learned as a lesson a couple of times is that that's actually quite appreciated. There's a lot of people who are in circumstances where they're not actually interested in taking a gamble on compensation. That for them, it's more important to take a high base salary than it is to have a set of lottery tickets that could turn into something fantastical or could turn into nothing, which is what they usually do, right? So I think for us, that's just been a great mix, right? We've been able to attract people who are attracted to that situation and feel really good about the compensation that we can set up because we can afford it. So that's kind of our stance on it. And the final thing on that is it's just simpler. As I just said, we don't have any full-time managers at Basecamp. Managing pay and the intricacies of that and so on was a task that fell mainly to Jason and I. And every single year we'd go like, shit, how do we figure this out? It was much easier to us to simply say, like, what if we try to systematize this and make it fair and equitable, pick a process where we could just say, like, we're going to just pay at the top of the market. Like, that's actually the easiest, rather than try to see what could we get away with. Can we get Jill to take a lesser pay because she doesn't complain so much about pay and she hasn't asked for a raise in 2 years? And then Jack, let's pay him a little more because he's actually squeaking right now and saying, like, he wants to be paid more, he'll change his job. That always felt like such a shitty way to run a business to me. Like, what's the least we can get away with paying people? It's just bad.
Totally. So I want to ask for practical tips, right? More for people working in or managing remote companies. I understand the biggest practical tip is if you're not in a current remote working situation where you can work wherever the hell you want, get into one. But once people are in them, I mean, how do you make these successful? And again, I'll bite my tongue and maybe I'll encourage people to pay special attention to this part because everything that you guys are teaching in the book is stuff that we've implemented and is working incredibly.
Yeah, so I think that's a great point. And I think that's sometimes missed in this conversation with remote work is that there are really some principles that can help you. But most of those principles are not so specific to remote work. They're just really good general principles of how you should run your business. It's just that remote shines a different sense of light on it, right? You mentioned before this sense of like, is someone working? Are they here? When you work together in an office, you have this native sense of whether someone is working, because you can simply look over at their desk and see whether their computer is on and they have their butt in their seat, right? And then you assume that they're working, which, by the way, is a terrible assumption.
Right.
People are imminently capable of not working, even though they sit at a desk.
Learn that the hard way. Yes.
And I think that's that misconception that people have is, if I can see someone in front of their computer typing, it means that they're doing productive, effective work for the company. When you don't have that, when you can't actually see your employee sitting in front of a computer typing away, sort of that illusion falls away. And what is left is simply a view of the actual work. And that's where it then comes in that what you have to do is evaluate the actual work. What is someone accomplishing? Are they accomplishing that in a timely manner at a quality that you believe is reasonable? Are they working well with their coworkers? These are the questions that everyone should be asking, but the ones that you are forced to ask quicker and sooner when you work remote, because you can't fall back on the crutch of being able to see butts and seats, right? Mm-hmm. So I think finding a way of measuring, or not even measuring, because it's not about like metrics. It's about a sense of like, is someone doing well here, right? I'm a firm believer that the vast majority of everyone everywhere, they want to do good work. No one comes to work if that work environment is a safe, healthy, supportive, sustainable work environment and think, in which ways can I skirt? In which ways can I shirk my responsibilities? In which ways can I do less than what people would expect of me? Can I do shitty work today? No one shows up thinking about that unless the business provokes them into thinking about that. And certainly lots of businesses do, right? If you feel like a company is taking advantage of you, you're not exactly likely to turn in good work unless you're heavily monitored, right? But that's a very antagonistic work relationship, and one you certainly shouldn't have. Well, you shouldn't have it anywhere, but if you try to have that in a creative environment, I mean, it's just going to crater all the faster, right? Because maybe you can force someone to sit and put together widgets at an assembly line at a certain rate, even if they hate you, right? I mean, if an assembly worker despises their boss, they're probably still able to put together their widgets under surveillance, right? If you have a programmer or a designer or a writer and they despise you, the impact on the quality of the work is going to be severe, and it's going to be very hard for sort of someone to suss that out just by looking at whether they're there or not. You actually have to look at the work, which I find it's just such a funny thing, because why aren't you looking at the work in the first place? Isn't this why you have employees? Because you want work done. And if you're not able to tell whether they're doing good work or not doing good work, how do you tell whether they're any good or not? How did you even hire that person in the first place? So you have to develop that eye for checking up on that and checking in with that, because that's also what employees want. They want feedback on their work. Are we doing it right? Are we following things as we should? Are we making progress towards the goals for the business? So I think that's probably the primary place to start, figuring out a way to assess the quality of the work that's being done. And we have a bunch of techniques at Basecamp. Obviously, we use Basecamp to run Basecamp. And one of the questions, we have a couple of questions on Basecamp to kind of just help with the transparency. Because one of the hard times sometimes can be like, I don't really know. Like, what is someone working on? Well, we just ask, or actually Basecamp asks. Basecamp has this feature called automatic check-ins, where you can ask the whole team a question at a regular interval. So every single day, we ask a question called, what did you work on today? Mm-hmm. And once a week, we ask, what are you going to work on this week? And just the answers to those two questions give you a really good sense of what people are working on. And it actually also, over a long period of time, gives you a sense of whether someone is stuck or need help. Like, if they keep filling in either anemic or missing answers to the what did you work on today question, it doesn't matter in the short term. Everyone has good days and bad days. But if it goes on week after week after week, okay, you have a clear tell that something is not quite right and you should be checking up and checking in on it. And the second thing for us, at least, is that we work in cycles. So the main work at Basecamp happens in these 6-week cycles, where within 6 weeks, that's our budget for just about everything. There's some exceptions to that, but the vast majority of new features that make it into Basecamp are being developed on a 6-week budget when they're sort of a major scope. And that's not that much time. You can't just sit around wasting week after week and then expect to ship quality software in 6 weeks, right? So if someone is not performing at the level that their peers expect them to, because a lot of this comes from peers too. It's not just about managers. It's if you're working together with someone else on a project and they're not pulling their share, you know what? That's just not fun. That's not great, right? And as I said, even if you have one person out of company who's either going through something or isn't motivated or isn't skilled or whatever to do the work that needs to be done, then whoever that person needs to work with will notice. And they'll go like, this isn't quite fair, right? Like I'm putting in my share and we're not seeing your share being put in. So that kind of just pops up when you have some sort of time boxing going on. If you just have projects that could run forever, or if you run with the quote unquote when it's done, I think it's much harder to unearth these troubles early on. But if you have this idea that like you're going to check in on the work, you're going to ask people to basically tell the rest of the company and you in their own words, what did they work on, what they intend to work on. And then you have this, as we do for us, this cycle idea of every 6 weeks, we're going to ship something. I mean, we may not, but then that's at least some kind of failure or whatever. And that's something that we didn't expect. But otherwise, like you got to put in the work to make that happen. And then it kind of just sorts itself out.
Brilliant. I love that. And we use a software called Status Hero, which does those check-ins on Slack. And it's been really, really great for all of us to understand what other people are doing. And yeah, I love it. I assume you guys also use Slack. I think I read that in remote.
We don't. In fact, first of all, Basecamp has chat built in.
Aha. Okay.
The other reason is that we're actually not that big fans of chat. I think chat is one of those things that have gotten a lot of hype, in part because Slack made a great product that captured the imagination of a lot of people, and lots of people got exposed to chat. But we've actually been using chat since the inception of Basecamp. We had a chat product since, I think, 2005 called Campfire. We have over decades of experience using chat. And one of the things we've learned from chat is that the number one failure of chat is to overuse chat. People get this sense that like, oh, now we have this fast medium where we can instantly get updates from everyone and everyone can follow along. And it turns into this just conveyor belt of anxiety where you constantly have to clear your rooms and clear your unreads and check in on everything because otherwise you might miss it. Oh, this important discussion that I wanted to weigh in on, shit, it just passed me by. It scrolled by because I was away from my computer for an hour. How can you do long stretch productive work for hours and hours at the time if you're constantly worried that real-time conversations are going to scroll you by in Slack because you weren't there? I think that chat is actually an anti-pattern of productivity and work in many circumstances. Not in all circumstances, and in some things it's wonderful and it's the only thing that really works, but I see it right now as dramatically and tragically overused, and it's leading to this sense of exhaustion from a lot of people who feel like they have this obligation to constantly stick around in the Slack room such that they catch everything, such that they chime in on everything. How can you give dedicated attention to actual work if you're trying to constantly keep half an eye on the scrolling chat log? My business partner, Jason, wrote a wonderful post on Signal versus Noise about this topic called Is Group Chat Making You Sweat? Which is really in-depth exploration of all the drawbacks and pitfalls of using chat as a major form of communication within a business. And we've been actually trying to wean ourselves off chat more and more. What we find more productive at Basecamp is to use asynchronous communication, fully considered thoughts. Someone sits down and doesn't just compose an idea off the top of their head, stream of consciousness, one line at a time. Do you know what? Most ideas aren't that good. Most ideas are not so good that they can just be streamed straight off your consciousness into a chat room and then be presented in anything that sort of resembles a coherent, comprehensive answer, right? So what we ask people to do is instead do the opposite. Go away from the sort of the chat room, sit down, compose actual paragraphs. I don't know, people might not have heard of these recently since everything went to instant messenger and chat. Do you know what? You can actually put down lines together, and if you form a handful of them, they turn into a paragraph, and if you turn multiple paragraphs and you string them together, you can form cohesive arguments for complete ideas. And it's a wonderful way to collaborate. It's a wonderful way to communicate. It's a wonderful way to think things through thoroughly and giving people a chance to actually consider full thoughts before they react. Because the other problem with chat is as you're streaming things off consciousness, people are just inclined to react to every single sort of batch of that stream, rather than taking the whole idea in full, giving it 5 minutes, giving it a considered reply that they take time to actually compose. So I think this is one of our actually Jedi tricks at Basecamp. This is one of those hidden judo sort of advantages that I think most companies today, especially ones starting right now, are completely oblivious to, because Slack and other chat tools have been so phenomenally successful. And they've really, unfortunately, they've taken off some terrible shit. I mean, email for the longest time used to get so much grief because people's emails inboxes would just fill up, and they filled up with a bunch of shit like, oh, should we go to lunch, or where should we go? Like all this chitter chatter. But we threw the baby out with the bathwater when we threw out the idea of composing complete thoughts in a sort of systematic way. So that's what we focus on at Basecamp. We focus more on having people think things through, present complete thoughts to the whole company, then giving the rest of the company not just 5 minutes before the lines scroll off the chat, but several hours, perhaps in some cases even days, to think through their response. And we find that the quality of thinking, the clarity of thinking, goes up drastically when we give it that kind of space.
I love everything you just said around not getting distracted, and also, you know, when combined with all the ideas and opinions that you've been sharing on Twitter with regards to Facebook and it's sinking its claws into kind of our psyche and the unhealthiness of really the effect that all this technology is having on us. I think we are more than set up for either your fourth book or our third interview on just digital detox.
Well, it's funny because that is actually almost the topic of our fourth book, which is coming out this year. It's called The Calm Company. And this sense of calm actually came exactly from these conversations as the one we just had. Us realizing that there's a lot of companies right now that use all this modern technology like Slack and other chat tools and whatever else have you, and 500 other tools, by the way, which is one of the other sources of anxiety. Where did you post this thing? Oh, is it on Dropbox? No, it's in Google Docs. Yes. No, actually, I think I posted it on Slack. Oh, no, was it in Asana? Oh, no, it was, right, you know the drill. That's actually not a calm place. It's not a productive place. And we think because we're adopting new modern tools that we're getting better. And in many ways, we're getting worse. We're regressing. We're getting less done. We're getting less important things done. We're being less effective. And we're being less effective while things are getting crazier, while we're working longer hours, while people take this absurd masochistic pleasure in saying, oh, it's so crazy at work. What? Why is it crazy at work? Work shouldn't be crazy. If work is crazy, like that's crazy. And it's time to sort of push the reset button. And that's what we're trying to do with this forthcoming book, The Calm Company, and push the reset button on a lot of these tactics that people have adopted that actually they seemed on the surface as though they were making things better, and they ended up making things worse. And I think chat, unfortunately, for a lot of companies, fall into that category, that there's a honeymoon phase for several months where people adopt a tool like that, where they go like, oh my God, this is so awesome. I have instant access to everyone in the company, and I can just mention them, or I can mention everyone, and everyone just comes running and they'll answer my questions right away. I used to perhaps have to wait a couple of hours for a response on email, and now I get instant response. Isn't this great? And then you start realizing like what the cost of that is, what the cost of the constant interruptions and the cost of forcing everyone to pay attention to this moving conveyor belt really is. And you go like, shit, this was a deal with the devil. Yes, I got something back, but I gave up far, far more than what I bargained for.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And well, I guess the big question is, when can I get my hands on this book to send it to my entire staff?
Well, we hope to have it out this year. We just signed with the publisher. The book is about 3/4 done. So hopefully it's going to be out in, I don't know, August, September, sometime in the fall period. And we're really excited about it because I think the time is just now. The time is right for pushing reset, stop glorifying crazy at work, pulling back, becoming a calm company. And part of becoming a calm company is becoming a productive company, an effective company, rather than just a busy company.
I can't wait to get my hands on it. David, I want to really thank you for your time, your generosity, and your wisdom. You know, it's not an obvious thing for someone who prides himself on not spending more than 40 hours a week and who has such a rich life full of hobbies to give us over an hour of your time. And I really, really appreciate that. Every time we chat, it's an absolute pleasure. So thank you for that. And also, I want to really, really encourage our listeners today. In a second, I'm going to ask you where people should reach out and everything, but personally want to give a plug for your books because they've so shaped the way that I think, the way that we do things in my company in such a positive way. And I also want to really encourage people to check out your Twitter feed because I think you're talking about a lot of really interesting and important subjects that are going on in society. And I love the way that you think, and I love the way that you problem solve and challenge people to do the same themselves.
Thank you so much. I mean, if people want to read up or check out the books that we've written, basecamp.com/books has an inventory of the 3 books we have out right now. And I'll put up a link to our 4th upcoming book there as well. And then on Twitter, it's @DHH. I will give fair warning that not only do I swear and talk about all sorts of different topics, and some of the topics I talk about might very well be near and dear to your heart, and I might have a different opinion. So a lot of that, and it's a pretty high volume feed at times. So just fair warning given. If you want to get the fire hose of my stream of consciousness, then the Twitter feed is certainly a good outlet for that. And then otherwise, I'd say the better place to start is my books. My books are exactly that long form, considered take, where Twitter is the sort of shooting from the hip, forming the ideas as they pop into my head. The edited version is in the books.
Well, both are brilliant, and I recommend both of them. I do want to ask you before I let you go, what would you hope 10 years from now, if people remember one thing from this episode, what would you hope for it to be?
Oh, geez, that's a big question. Well, I'd hope that there's just one idea within this that kind of just pulled loose some established cornerstone of how you think the world is supposed to be. And if you just have a loose stone, you have a starting place, right? You have something you can pull on, and you can take that out and you can examine it from a new perspective. And once you examine just one of your closely held beliefs from a new perspective, or not even closely held beliefs, but just assumptions about how the world is supposed to work, I find that is the first step on this wonderful journey of starting to question everything.
Brilliant. David, again, thank you. This has been such a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me again.
All right, super friends, that is all we have for you today. But I hope you guys really enjoyed the show, and I hope you learned a ton of actionable information, tips, advice that will help you go out there and overcome the impossible. If you've enjoyed the show, please take a moment to leave us a review on iTunes or Stitcher, or drop us a quick little note on the Twitter machine @GoSuperhuman. Also, if you have any ideas for anyone out there who you would love to see on the show, we always love to hear your recommendations. You can submit on our website, or you can just drop us an email and let us know. That's all for today, guys. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for tuning in to the Becoming Superhuman podcast. For more great skills and strategies, or for links to any of the resources mentioned in this episode, visit www.becomingasuperhuman.com/podcast. We'll see you next time.